We are now less than a year away from the 2020 presidential election, and for the Democratic nomination, the race is still wide open. The candidates hit the trail in Iowa this weekend. A recent poll from the state shows just how tight the race is. Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Joe Biden are all within just a few points of each other. Our Ed O'Keefe has more on this from Des Moines.
You see it's coming into focus, you and Warren.
Yeah, and certainly a world where we're getting somewhere is that world, where it's coming down to the two of us. Obviously,
Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg is indeed on the rise here in Iowa, but he's not alone, with new polling showing that former Vice President Joe Biden and Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders maintain a grip on the top spots in the race for president. On Sunday, Buttigieg backtracked, telling CBSN it's not yet a two-way race.
Yeah, that didn't come out right. I can't remember the exact context for that.
But not before other candidates shot down his theory.
It's naive for him to think that at this point the fate of this election has been determined. It is very important that anyone who wants to be a leader has the ability to walk and talk with every community.
Hello.
That's a knock on Buttigieg's weak standing with Black and Latino voters. Candidates like Julian Castro say the party needs a nominee who can get them to the polls.
If that person can't connect with those communities, they simply should not be at the top of the ticket. It's too risky.
Meanwhile, the top issue of conversation this weekend, health care, and Warren's plan to pay for it, which would divert the funds employers currently pay private health care companies to the government and increase taxes on the wealthy.
It doesn't raise taxes on anybody but billionaires. And you know what? The billionaires can afford it, and I don't call them middle class.
Moderates like Joe Biden dismissed Senator Warren's payment plan, saying that instead the country should be focused on building Obamacare. Even Bernie Sanders, the original architect of Medicare for All, says he would raise taxes on Americans, but that ultimately co-pays and premiums would go down. Ed O'Keefe, CBS News, Des Moines, Iowa.
And CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns has also been tracking the race from Des Moines, Iowa, and she joins us now. Hi, Caitlin. So what stood out to you from this weekend in Iowa?
Hi, Tanya. Well, you mentioned it's a year until the actual election, but 3 months until the caucuses here in Iowa, and it certainly feels like crunch time for a lot of these campaigns. You had one in Beto O'Rourke have to drop out of the race. You've had Kamala Harris reassessing her campaign, and you've had Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg surging here, at least in Iowa, trying to capitalize on momentum, holding dueling rallies across the state over the weekend. And you have Joe Biden, who is trying to manage expectations for his campaign in the early states, trying to message to voters that even if he is lagging in a state like Iowa or New Hampshire, that he has a broad and diverse coalition that can help him succeed in South Carolina and to the early states. So the big question is kind of what kind of reshuffling we're seeing, if any, and how these candidates plan to really hit the ground running and get people to commit to caucusing for them in a few months' time.
And Caitlin, you sat down with Mayor Pete Buttigieg one-on-one. He told you that, like President Trump, who had never held office before being elected, there's energy for someone like him in the race. Let's listen to what he said.
A guy like Donald Trump would never have been able to get within cheating distance of the Oval Office if Americans were happy with what politics had produced as of a few years ago, and I think the same is true today. There's a lot of frustration with the Washington way of doing business, with the political warfare that's going on, and I do think that continues to create a lot of energy for an outsider like me. Now, we've also seen just how much harm a figure like Donald Trump can do. I think the point is it doesn't work with just any outsider. It matters what you care about and whether you're committed to uniting rather than dividing the American people as president. And my message is one of solving these problems and working really hard to unite the American people, too.
Now, Caitlin, as you know, Buttigieg has been rising in the polls. What makes him stand out more than someone with a long history in politics? It's got to be more than just his outsider status.
Right. He is campaigning as the youngest candidate in this race, someone who is openly gay and someone who was an executive of a city in the Midwest. And so that's been a really big part of his pitch, especially in a place like Iowa. And I can say, you know, after being on that bus tour with him and following his campaign on the ground here, there certainly seems to be a lot of energy around his campaign. We were talking to voters who were more inclined to Joe Biden at the beginning of this race and are now moving over to Pete Buttigieg, they told us, while also still assessing these other candidates. So he's certainly trying to capitalize on that and keep it up. The reason I asked about, whether voters might be willing to take a risk on some candidate like him, who is an outsider or may not be the conventional candidate, is because with the election of Donald Trump, that's what people have been wondering. And that's been part of Joe Biden's pitch to voters here, that he is a reliable choice, that he could fit the role of the presidency, do the job on day one. So we're kind of seeing these competing visions for the country from these candidates.
And we're also starting to see, the gloves are coming off a little bit with the front runners. You asked Buttigieg about Warren railing against consultant-driven campaigns and whether she's talking about him when she says that. Let's listen to his response.
I don't know what she's talking about, but I can tell you what I'm talking about, and it's answers that work. You take, for example, healthcare. I'm proposing Medicare for all who want it. That means getting a version of Medicare available for everyone. But I'm not going to dictate to you whether you should be on that plan or not. I think that Americans should be free to choose whether they want the private plan or the Medicare plan we're going to set up. I think if we get it right, pretty much everybody's going to want in on that Medicare plan, but I'm not going to decide for you.
So tell us more about the dynamic between Buttigieg and Warren at this point in the race.
Yeah, over the weekend, Buttigieg got some criticism for playing pundit by saying that this was coming down to a two-person race. He since backtracked that in our interview as well. But I really think it spoke to the way in which the campaigns are really coming into focus. And this weekend, we saw that the knives are certainly out, that these candidates know that they are really competing against each other in this kind of 3-month stretch to the caucus. You heard a really distinct contrast drawn by Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg against one another. You had Elizabeth Warren saying that you can't win this primary and the general election without a big fight. And you've had Pete Buttigieg trying to campaign on this message of unity and that some fights are necessary, but can't be kind of the overriding message. And so that's kind of the two visions that we're seeing from them, and something that is resonating in Iowa. And so that's what we have to figure out over the next couple of months, is which of those visions these voters pick.
Right. And as you said earlier, Caitlin, it certainly is starting to be crunch time for so many of these campaigns. Kamala Harris said that she is practically living in Iowa right now. This, of course, comes after a recent campaign shakeup where she got rid of a field office and laid off staff in New Hampshire. So tell us about the senator's strategy in Iowa. Is this make or break for her?
Yeah, 'tis the season for shakeups and breakups. This is what campaigns are trying to do right now, is reassess where they are if they're not at that top tier, if they're not getting that kind of money that we've seen for some of these other candidates. So Kamala Harris has diverted resources. She's cut her field staff in New Hampshire. She's focusing. She's all in on Iowa. She did have a rousing speech at a big Democratic dinner on Friday, showed a show of organization, and that's really important in a state like Iowa. It is a challenging time for her campaign to make that case that while she's cutting staff elsewhere, make that case to Iowa voters that she can be able to go the distance as voters are looking for someone who can defeat Donald Trump. So we'll see if this pays off. We've seen in the past other candidates, John Kerry, John McCain, had to kind of reboot their campaigns after really struggling, and went on, of course, to success, at least in getting the nomination. We'll see if Kamala Harris is able to follow that same path.
And Caitlin, this is not your first, trip through Iowa. You reported before from Iowa that impeachment was not brought up at all. So was it brought up this time? And what are voters there saying on the topic?
That's right. I was here 2 weeks ago and was struck by all the town halls I went to when impeachment did not come up. And I found the same dynamic happening this weekend. I went to several presidential town halls, and no voter asked about impeachment, either in the candidate town halls or talking with us before and after events. And I actually asked Pete Buttigieg about that dynamic on the bus with him yesterday. And he said, it's probably because most of these voters know where the candidates stand on impeachment. And when they get the chance to actually ask a question, they want to ask about something that's affecting their everyday life, having a real impact on their lives. So they're asking about health care. They're asking about the environment. Climate is a huge issue here. Asking about jobs and other issues. Gun safety is a huge issue as well on the campaign trail. So I think it's also because you only have one House member running for the nomination. You have several senators running, but the impeachment inquiry has not gotten to the Senate yet. So that dynamic could change like later this year. and maybe in January. But for now, voters are really focused on kind of the kitchen table issues, and the candidates are taking note.
I hear you. Caitlin Huey-Burns in Iowa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.